The air in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a combat knife. Julian stood pinned against the kitchen counter of the premium transitional apartment, his hands shaking as he reached for a glass of water he didn't actually want. For months, he had been the master puppeteer, pulling the strings of everyone's sympathy. But tonight, the stage had collapsed. Standing right in front of him was Sarah, the woman whose bleeding heart he had systematically drained. But she wasn't looking at him with compassion anymore. Her eyes were ice, and behind her, blocking the only exit to the apartment, were 12 of the largest, most battle-hardened men Julian had ever seen in his life. Men with scars. Men with heavy treading on their boots. Men who actually knew what a theater of war felt like. You've got 5 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't let these boys give you a real taste of what PTSD feels like, Julian, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a deadly, quiet whisper. Julian swallowed hard, looking at the wall of muscle surrounding him. His smooth tongue, the one that had grifted thousands of dollars and endless sleepless nights out of Sarah's charity, completely failed him. He was trapped, and he knew exactly how he had gotten here. To understand the sheer audacity of what Julian did, you have to understand Sarah. Sarah wasn't just running a nonprofit, she was running a lifeline. She had founded Homefront Horizons 5 years earlier after watching her own brother struggle to adapt to civilian life after 2 tours in Helmand Province. She saw how the system failed the men and women who gave everything. She saw the bureaucratic red tape, the cold waiting rooms, and the crushing isolation that drove so many veterans to the brink. So Sarah built a sanctuary. Homefront Horizons didn't just hand out pamphlets. They provided fully furnished, premium transitional housing. They offered intensive job placement, mental health counseling, and a tight-knit community where no one was left behind. Sarah poured her inheritance, her weekends, and every ounce of her soul into the foundation. She was the director, the late-night crisis counselor, the resume editor, and the driver. If a veteran needed a ride to a VA appointment at 5 o'clock a.m., Sarah was in her sedan with a thermos of hot coffee, waiting outside. Her staff was tiny, mostly volunteers. Her right-hand man was Marcus, a retired Army Master Sergeant who handled the intake processing and background verifications. Marcus was a human lie detector test with a shaved head and a clipboard, but even the most meticulous systems have a blind spot. Even when someone knows exactly how to weaponize human kindness. It was a rainy Tuesday in October when Julian walked through the clinic doors. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a ghost. He was handsome in a rugged, tragic sort of way. Dark hair curling slightly from the rain, a light stubble, and eyes that constantly darted around the room as if expecting an ambush. He sat on the edge of the couch in the lobby, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. Sarah noticed him immediately. She left her office and sat on the coffee table opposite him, gently placing a warm mug of tea near his hands. "Hey there," she said softly. "I'm Sarah. You look like you've had a long road." Julian looked up, his eyes glassy with tears. I shouldn't be here," he stammered, his voice cracking perfectly. "There are guys who need this more than me. I'm fine. I can just sleep in my car." That was the hook. The classic, "I don't want to be a burden" routine. It was designed to make Sarah press harder, and it worked flawlessly. "Nobody sleeps in their car here," Sarah said firmly. "Tell me your name." Julian, he whispered. I just got back into town. I was deployed. RC South. I can't sleep, Sarah. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the mortars. I hear my buddies screaming. I can't hold down a job. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Within 2 hours, Julian had Sarah completely wrapped around his finger. Normally, Marcus would run a comprehensive check on the DD-214, the military discharge papers, before any housing was assigned. But Julian had a heartbreaking excuse. All his belongings, including his paperwork, had been stolen from his car 2 nights ago. He was completely destitute. Marcus, we have to bypass the queue, Sarah told her volunteer later that afternoon in the break room. The premium apartment on 4th Street just opened up. He's in an acute crisis. If we leave him on the street tonight, he might become a statistic. Marcus frowned, tapping his pen against his clipboard. Sarah, you know the rules. No paperwork, no placement. We've been burned before. Let me at least get a verbal verification from the records center. He's shaking, Marcus. He has severe unmedicated combat PTSD, Sarah insisted, her voice rising with protective fury. I'll take personal responsibility for him. Fast track the keys. Marcus sighed, knowing better than to argue with Sarah when her maternal instincts were locked on. Fine, but I'm digging into his file the second the government database updates. By 6:00 p.m., Julian was unlocking the door to a gorgeous 2-bedroom apartment. The pantry was stocked, the linens were fresh, and the rent was completely covered by the charity's donor fund for the next 6 months. He turned to Sarah, a tear slipping down his cheek, and hugged her tightly. You saved my life, he whispered. Sarah smiled, feeling a profound sense of purpose. She had no idea she had just let a parasite into her sanctuary. The honeymoon phase lasted exactly 3 days. Then the draining began. It started with a phone call at 3:14 a.m. Sarah was sound asleep when her phone buzzed violently on her nightstand. She bolted upright, her heart hammering, thinking there was an emergency at one of the houses. Sarah, please don't hang up. Julian's voice gasped through the speaker. He sounded like he was hyperventilating, terrified. I'm on the floor. The shadows. I think someone is trying to kick the door in. It looks like the compound in Kandahar. I can't breathe. Julian, breathe with me, Sarah said, throwing her blankets off and rushing to put on her shoes. Are you hurt? Did you take your medication? I don't have any medication. The VA lost my appointment. Please, Sarah, I don't trust anyone else. If the police come, they'll shoot me. You're the only one who understands. Sarah didn't hesitate. She drove 20 minutes across town in the dead of night. When she arrived, she found Julian sitting on the kitchen floor, perfectly styled in his tactical gear, holding a glass of bourbon. He gripped her hand, sobbing into her shoulder for 2 hours while she talked him down. By the time she got home, it was 5:45 a.m. She had to be back at the office by 8:00 a.m. This wasn't an isolated incident. Within 3 weeks, the 3:00 a.m. panic attacks became a tri-weekly routine, and the requests began to expand. Sarah, my car broke down completely, Julian told her over coffee one afternoon. He looked down, playing the humble victim. I have a mandatory therapy evaluation across town, and if I miss it, they'll cut off my disability claims. I don't know what to do. Uber is so expensive. Don't worry, I'll drive you, Sarah said, canceling her afternoon budget meetings. She spent 3 hours sitting in a hospital waiting room while Julian allegedly went in for his appointment. In reality, as she would later find out, he was meeting a friend at a diner down the street. Then came the financial bleeding. "The VA is delaying my back pay," Julian told Sarah, looking utterly devastated in her office. "I can't even afford groceries, Sarah. And my mom, she needs her blood pressure medication, and I can't help her. I feel like less than a man. I survived an IED blast just to starve in the country I protected." Sarah's heart broke. She reached into the desk drawer where the charity's emergency petty cash fund was kept. It was meant for absolute catastrophes, preventing immediate evictions or buying emergency baby formula for veteran families. "Here," Sarah said, handing him the $400. "Take it. We'll categorize it as an emergency stipend." "Thank you," Julian said, his eyes gleaming. "You're an angel." Over the course of 4 months, Julian systematically dismantled Sarah's life. She gave him over $3,500 from the emergency fund in small, guilt-induced increments. She missed her own best friend's wedding because Julian had a flashback episode that required her to sit with him in a dark room for 6 hours. She was running on caffeine and adrenaline, her own health deteriorating, while Julian seemed to be thriving. He was looking tan, wearing nice new clothes, and spending an awful lot of time at local bars, which he claimed was social exposure therapy. Whenever Marcus tried to intervene, Sarah snapped at him. "He's traumatized, Marcus. You don't understand how deep his wounds are. We can't abandon him." But Marcus wasn't listening to her excuses anymore. He was staring at a computer screen, waiting for a government email to finally come through. It was a Friday morning when the hammer dropped. Sarah was sipping her third cup of coffee, trying to review the quarterly budget, which was dangerously in the red due to unforeseen client emergencies. Marcus walked into her office without knocking. He didn't say a word. He just threw a thick manila folder onto her desk. It landed with a heavy thud. Sarah looked up, annoyed. "Marcus, I'm right in the middle of—" "Read it," Marcus said, his voice dangerously calm. "Read every damn page, Sarah." Sarah sighed and opened the file. The top page was an official document from the National Personnel Records Center. It bore the Department of Defense seal. She scanned down to the name, Julian Vance. Her eyes flew down the text. Her brain struggled to process the words. Julian Vance had enlisted in the United States Army 5 years ago. He had never been to Afghanistan. He had never been to Iraq. He had never even completed basic training. According to the official military record, Julian had been at Fort Moore for exactly 42 days before he was caught systematically stealing wallets, laptops, and watches from the lockers of his fellow recruits while they were out on field exercises. When confronted by his drill sergeant, he had tried to blame another recruit, causing a massive brawl in the barracks. He was court-martialed, spent time in a military brig, and was given a dishonorable discharge for larceny. He wasn't a combat veteran. He was a petty thief who had spent 42 days in boot camp before being kicked out in absolute disgrace. Sarah sat frozen, the paper trembling in her hands. Every 3:00 a.m. phone call, every tear he shed, every dollar she took from an actual suffering family to hand to him, it was all an act, a calculated, rehearsed performance designed to exploit her deepest vulnerabilities. "He lied," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "Everything. The IED, the flashbacks, his friends dying. It was all bullshit." "He's a parasite, Sarah," Marcus said, leaning over the desk. He looked up our charity, saw how much you care, and targeted you. He's been living rent-free in a luxury apartment on our donors' dimes while real vets are sleeping on the streets waiting for a spot. A cold, terrifying wave of fury washed over Sarah. The sadness disappeared, replaced by a white-hot rage that hardened her spine. She stood up, grabbing the file. "Where are you going?" Marcus asked. "To his apartment," Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave. "I'm going to go get my keys." Sarah didn't call ahead. She drove to the 4th Street apartment, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor, walked down the carpeted hallway, and pounded on the door to apartment 3B. A few moments later, the door swung open. Julian stood there, wearing a brand new silk bathrobe, holding a PlayStation controller in one hand. He looked relaxed, happy, and completely at ease. "Oh, Sarah, hey!" Julian smiled warmly, stepping back. "Man, it's good to see you. I was actually just having a really rough morning. The anxiety is through the roof today. I was about to call you." "Cut the crap, Julian," Sarah said, pushing past him into the pristine, beautifully decorated living room. Julian blinked, his smile faltering slightly. "Whoa, Sarah, what's wrong? You're bringing a lot of negative energy into my safe space right now. My therapist says I need to avoid stress." "Your therapist?" Sarah barked out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You mean the one you don't have? Or maybe the drill sergeant you stole from?" She snatched the manila folder and slammed it onto the glass coffee table. Julian looked down at the Department of Defense logo. For a fraction of a second, a flash of absolute panic crossed his face. But then, right before Sarah's eyes, his expression shifted. The vulnerable, broken soldier vanished. In his place stood a smug, arrogant sociopath. He didn't apologize. He didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, he leaned back against the counter, crossed his arms, and let out a soft, mocking chuckle. "So, you found my paperwork," Julian said, his voice entirely devoid of the shaky, trembling cadence he usually used. "Good for you. Marcus finally did some actual work for once." "You were never in combat," Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage. "You stole from your own platoon mates during basic training. You were kicked out after 6 weeks. You spent months crying on my shoulder about dead friends who never existed." "Oh, please," Julian scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Do you have any idea how traumatic basic training actually is? The psychological abuse from those drill sergeants is real, Sarah. The screaming, the sleep deprivation, it broke me. I do have trauma. Just because I didn't get blown up doesn't mean my pain isn't valid." Sarah stared at him, utterly dumbfounded by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words. "Are you fucking insane? You were comparing being yelled at by an instructor for 6 weeks because you're a thief to the men and women who watched their friends die in active combat?" "Trauma is relative, Sarah," Julian said, his voice rising, turning aggressive. He stepped closer to her, trying to use his height to intimidate her. "And honestly, this charity is a joke anyway. This apartment is cheap. The appliances are outdated. You guys don't even provide a proper grocery stipend. I've been doing you a favor by testing out your services. You should be thanking me for showing you where the holes in your little system are." "Pack your bags," Sarah said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You have 30 minutes to get out of this apartment. Your housing agreement is revoked, effective immediately." Julian laughed out loud. He took a step closer, looking down at her with pure malice. Or what, Sarah? What are you gonna do? Call the cops? Go ahead. I'm a tenant here. I have rights. In this state, it takes 3 to 6 months to legally evict someone. If you touch my stuff, I'll sue you and your pathetic little nonprofit into bankruptcy. I'm not going anywhere. This is my apartment. Now get the hell out of my face before I call the police on you for harassment. Sarah looked at him. She looked at his smug, victorious grin. He thought he had won. He thought he knew the rules of the game. Sarah smiled back. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just found her breaking point. Okay, Julian, she said softly. Have it your way. She turned around and walked out, slamming the door behind her. Julian spent the rest of the evening celebrating. He ordered a large pizza, opened a beer, and sat on his couch playing video games. He had played Sarah perfectly. He knew the law. He knew she couldn't legally throw him out without a lengthy court battle, and by then, he'd find another mark. He felt untouchable. At exactly 7:00 p.m., he heard a key turn in his front door lock. Julian frowned, sitting up. Sarah? I told you, if you come back in here, I'm calling the... The door swung wide open. Sarah stepped into the entryway, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Marcus, and behind Marcus stood 12 of the most imposing men Julian had ever seen. These weren't volunteers or administrative staff. These were members of Homefront Horizons' weekly peer-led combat veteran support group. There was Big Mike, a former Marine Raider who stood 6'4" and weighed 260 pounds of pure muscle. There was Jax, a retired Army Ranger with a prosthetic leg and arms covered in military tattoos. There was Leo, a silent, terrifyingly intense former Navy SEAL. They didn't carry weapons. They didn't need them. Their sheer physical presence filled the entire apartment, suffocating the air. Julian scrambled off the couch, his pizza slice dropping to the floor. His face turned ashen. What is this, Sarah? What the hell are you doing? Oh, didn't I mention it, Julian? Sarah said, casually stepping to the side as the 12 men filed into the living room, completely surrounding the couch and the kitchen counter. Every Friday at 7:00 p.m., our charity hosts its weekly group therapy session. Since you're such a deeply traumatized veteran who loves our services so much, I decided to bring the session directly to you, in your living room. Big Mike sat down in Julian's favorite armchair. The chair groaned under his weight. He looked at Julian, his face completely expressionless. So, Big Mike rumbled, his voice vibrating through the floorboards. I hear you were in RC South, Julian. I spent 2 years in Sangjin. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your deployment? We're all brothers here. We want to hear about the trauma that broke you. Julian backed away until his spine hit the kitchen counter. His knees were literally shaking. I don't have to tell you guys anything. Get out of my apartment. This is illegal. This is trespassing. Jax stepped forward, leaning his massive tattooed arms on the kitchen island, putting his face just inches from Julian's. It's not trespassing, kid. Sarah is the leaseholder for this foundation property. She invited us. And right now, we're having a breakthrough session. See, my buddy over there, Leo, he lost 3 friends to an IED in Fallujah. And he's really interested to hear about how your 42 days in basic training were. Tell us about the stolen wallets, Julian. Tell us how traumatic it was to get caught being a rat. Julian looked around the room. 12 pairs of eyes, hard as flint, were locked onto him. There was no sympathy here. There was no bleeding heart to manipulate. These were men who had stared into the abyss of actual war, and they looked at Julian like he was a piece of garbage stuck to the bottom of their boots. Julian stammered, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. I think there's been a misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, Marcus said, stepping forward with a large cardboard box, throwing it onto the floor. You have exactly 10 minutes to put your clothes in this box. If you're still here in 11 minutes, the boys and I are going to help you unpack indefinitely. We'll be sharing this apartment with you every single day, 24/7. The bravado, the tenants' rights, the threats of lawsuits, it all evaporated into thin air. Julian knew that if he called the police, the cops would arrive to find a peaceful group of decorated war veterans sitting in a circle having a therapy session while he looked like a lunatic. With his hands shaking violently, Julian ran into the bedroom. He didn't even bother to pack properly. He shoved his clothes, his video games, and his shoes into the cardboard box, sobbing under his breath. The veterans stood in the hallway, watching him in absolute suffocating silence. Not a single hand was raised against him, but the psychological pressure was brutal. 10 minutes later, Julian dragged the heavy cardboard box out of the apartment, wearing nothing but his bathrobe and a pair of flip-flops. As he reached the doorway, Sarah stopped him. She reached out her hand. The keys, Julian, she said, her voice ice cold. Julian dropped the keys into her palm, refusing to meet her eyes. He hoisted the box into his arms and practically ran down the hallway, frantically pressing the elevator button. The doors opened, and he vanished inside, thoroughly broken by the very community he had tried to exploit. The apartment went quiet. Big Mike looked at Sarah and let out a booming laugh. Good session, Sarah! Same time next week? Sarah looked at the keys in her hand, a massive weight lifting off her shoulders. Thanks, boys. Beers are on me. You would think that after being thoroughly humiliated, a normal person would go into hiding and keep their mouths shut. But as we know, the audacity of men like Julian knows absolutely no bounds. The next morning, Sarah's phone exploded. It wasn't Julian. He was too terrified to face her directly. Instead, he had deployed his flying monkeys, his enabling, delusional family. First came the text messages from his mother. How dare you treat a traumatized young man like that? Julian is a sensitive soul. He has medical conditions and you threw him onto the street like a dog. You run a charity? You're a monster. I'm reporting you to the Better Business Bureau. Then came a phone call from an unknown number. Sarah answered it only to hear a man's voice screaming through the line. It was Julian's cousin. Hey, you crazy bitch! You think you can intimidate my cousin with your gang of thugs? He served his country. Basic training counts as service. You stole his housing. We're getting a lawyer and we're going to ruin your life. Sarah sat at her desk, listening to the screaming voice on the phone. A few months ago, this would have sent her into a panic attack. She would have apologized, tried to find a compromise, or cried from the stress. But Sarah was completely out of empathy. Her tank was empty, and her patience was dead. She waited for the cousin to pause for breath. When he finally stopped screaming, Sarah spoke, her voice steady, clear, and perfectly enunciated. Listen to me very carefully, you delusional hillbillies, Sarah said, ensuring every syllable cut like glass. Julian is a pathetic, cowardly little thief who stole from his own platoon mates and got kicked out of boot camp after 6 weeks. He grifted thousands of dollars from a charity meant for real heroes. I have his official military record, his court-martial documents, and a detailed log of every single dollar he stole from my emergency fund. She took a slow, deep breath. If I hear your voice, his mother's voice, or any of your white trash family members' voices on my phone ever again, I am going to upload his entire military record, his mugshot from the brig, and the video footage of him scurrying out of this apartment in a bathrobe to every single Facebook group, every news outlet, and every veterans forum in this state. He will never be able to look for a job, go to a bar, or even show his face in public without being known as a stolen Valor rat. The line went completely dead. The cousin was silent. So, Sarah concluded, you can tell Julian, your aunt, and your entire enabling family to collectively fuck off in no uncertain terms. Have a wonderful day. She disconnected the call with a smile. The phone never rang again. The text messages stopped instantly. Julian and his family vanished into the shadows, terrified of the woman they thought they could easily destroy. 2 weeks later, the premium apartment on 4th Street had a new tenant. His name was David. He was a real Marine Corps veteran who had lost his home after a manufacturing plant layoff. He stood in the living room, holding his toddler daughter, while his wife wept tears of pure relief as she looked at the stocked pantry. Sarah stood by the window, watching them. Her charity was back to doing what it did best, saving lives. She had learned a hard lesson about boundaries, verifications, and the dark side of human nature. But she hadn't let Julian change who she was. She was still full of compassion. She just kept her eyes wide open now. Julian thought he could use his audacity to break a good woman and steal from the brave. But in the end, he found out what happens when the wolves stand up to protect the shepherd. Thank you for watching this episode of The Audacity of Him. What did you think of Sarah's unique eviction method? Would you have done the same thing? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories of toxic people getting exactly what they deserve. Until next time, stay sharp and don't let the grifters win.